Hello, and welcome to United for Peace, Episode 2.6, a UNEF Retrospective. Welcome to our final episode on the first United Nations Emergency Force. Last time, I said that we would take a look back at everything that has happened, what it all meant for the United Nations as an institution, and what it meant for peacekeeping as an instrument of global politics, along with what lessons were taken from it. This is roughly true, but I now would like to get a little more specific. Today, we are going to look at how the United Nations came to accept the idea of an armed peacekeeping mission, such as UNEF, review why it established it through the General Assembly, and why no further missions, would be established by the same. Also, we will see the politics leading Egypt to revoke consent for its operations, and how the UNEF demonstrated the UN's capabilities and its limitations. So let's begin. Starting from the top, how did the UN come to accept this sort of mission in the first place? Upon the drafting of the United Nations Charter, no nation foresaw such a thing ever happening in the organization's future. However, the need for peacekeeping abilities became apparent almost immediately after the creation of the UN. The veto power granted to the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus ideological incompatibility among its members, made it impossible for the UN to adequately address urgent situations regarding peace and security. The first major challenge came from the Balkans, as so many European security issues had over the last century. Please don't take that as an indictment of the people of the Balkan Peninsula. It's mostly because of power politics and ideology. This time, the concern was tension between Greece and its communist neighbors to the north, Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. In the aftermath of World War II, Greece struggled with continuous communist plots to overthrow the government, and it seems Greece's communists received support from these northern neighbors. With so many people still under arms everywhere, and existential threats still weighing heavy on everyone's mind, the simple fact of foreign nations supporting violent subversives in one's own country threatened eventual war. And, again, with this being right after World War II, everyone was beyond sick of war at this time, pretty much. UN observation teams, established by the UN General Assembly, made it easier to detect and prevent infiltration across borders, which helped Greece a little bit, although the Greek state security was ultimately due more to the Truman Doctrine than international observers. And in case you were wondering, yes, the creation of these teams was opposed by the Soviet Union, which made it clear that, in its view, only the Security Council could do such things. So with that, the concept of UN personnel appointed to directly intervene in the escalation of hostilities had been realized. Then it went even further with the creation of the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, UNTSO, which has been popping up pretty regularly throughout this series. The UNTSO was created by the Security Council, not the General Assembly. Pretty much everyone could agree that war between Israel and the Arab states was pretty bad, so incompatible ideologies or no, P5 veto power was not an issue. Nonetheless, it contributed to the idea that the UN would be involved in observing activity in areas of tension and doing what it could to keep tensions under wraps. The UN observer teams in Greece and the UNTSO both served a kind of unarmed police function. They watched out for illegal activities, reported them, and investigated them. They did not, however, possess the force necessary to enforce political terms of any sort, as traditional security forces would. Traditional security forces, here meaning armies or well-armed police. These two UN groups did not include armed personnel at all, as a matter of fact. The United Nations also had largely investigative and symbolic presences in places like Kashmir throughout the 40s and 50s, where trained military personnel were required for gathering and reporting information critical to understanding and settling conflicts. The United Nations Military Observation Group in India and Pakistan did not have armed observers, but they were in fact trained military personnel. This mission, too, was authorized by the Security Council. Having mentioned the symbolic value of UN presence where tension is rife, let's talk a little bit about the prestige the UN enjoyed in the aftermath of World War II and has largely lost between then and now. After all, this prestige does play an important part in the growing acceptance of the UN as an organization fit to establish peacekeeping bodies. Anyone even vaguely aware of World War II has heard the term Allies in reference to the US, Britain, Soviet Union, etc., fighting the axis of Germany, Japan, Italy, and company. Well, the term Allies isn't really a formal name. The alliance between the nations referred to as the Allies was founded largely on the pact known as the Declaration by United Nations, or simply United Nations Declaration. Drafting for the Declaration started in the United States at the end of 1941, and by January 2, 1942, had been signed by 26 governments. 21 more states would accede to it by the end of the war. The Declaration proclaimed each signatory's pledge, quote, to employ its full resources, military or economic, against those members of the Tripartite Pact and its adherents, end quote. And this was for the signatories, as the preamble said, quote, to defend life, liberty, independence, and religious freedom, and to preserve human rights and justice in their own lands as well as in other lands, end quote. Because, and I continue the quote now, they are now engaged in a common struggle against savage and brutal forces seeking to subjugate the world. And finally, that is the real end of the quoting here. So, during the war, the Allies were often referred to as specifically the United Nations Allies, or even simply the United Nations. This was de facto the formal name of the alliance, as all documents pertaining to the whole coalition, or speaking on behalf of it, was branded, if you will, as such. The principles of the United Nations Declaration and the signatories of that declaration became the first principles of the United Nations Charter, creating the civilian post-war organization. It's all continuous. The United Nations emerged from World War II as the representative body of those victorious nations who united to defeat the Axis, with the goal of making sure such a global conflict would never again erupt. As such, the United Nations' prestige in its early years was considerable, to say the least. Its goals and methods were widely supported, members were generally eager to lend support when and where they could, and opposing it was a dicey proposition at best. The consequence of all this is that when the United Kingdom and France invaded Egypt alongside Israel, as I hope I made clear, the whole world was shocked. And even if nothing could get past the Security Council due to the UK's and France's veto power, the United Nations sat in the General Assembly, summoned to an emergency session, would not abide such an egregious act of aggression going unanswered. So here we have an enormous piece of the answer to why the General Assembly approved UNEF. It's really three pieces acting as one. First, the Security Council could not approve such a mission because all substantive documents arising from the body could be vetoed by members actively engaged in the aggression in question. Second, people had already come to expect and accept the United Nations getting involved in peacekeeping efforts. Third, the real big one, which I really hammered on while discussing the creation of UNEF, the world simply was not going to accept nothing being done about the invasion. The UN General Assembly was pretty much just a convenient forum for states to discuss and formulate a response to the invasion. One gets the impression if the General Assembly did not act, then a great collection of states would have acted on their own, and that would have just been much messier and riskier with regards to global tensions and conflict. After all, the conflict sparked by the Suez War quite plausibly threatened to spin out of control into another world war, which, obviously, the United Nations quite explicitly existed to prevent. Furthermore, anyone committed to supporting the United Nations wanted any response to the invasion to originate in the UN. If it didn't, then the reputation and very legitimacy of the organization would have been jeopardized. Such flagrant aggression against Egyptian sovereignty was a move reminiscent of the violent past which the UN stood to usher the world away from. So, even when the Soviet Union's representative in the General Assembly argued that it was illegal for the body to establish an armed peacekeeping force, they did not vote against any of the resolutions which established or enabled it. Better to let the United Nations do something, however so, than to do nothing, or worse yet, allow the conflict to escalate with any further unilateral action on the part of any state. Both for the sake of peace and for the sake of maintaining the image and legitimacy of the United Nations, both particularly damaged by the fact that two of its permanent Security Council states were involved in the aggression at hand. Let us also bear in mind, by the time the UNEF was created, the Office of Secretary General had already become a vehicle for so many different kinds of fieldwork: administrative, economic, and paramilitary. While legal questions remained, the UN had already branched out into so many kinds of operation it was never envisioned to participate in upon its founding. Endeavoring to do new things, to find unique solutions to difficult problems, had been normalized for the UN. In fact, it had even become expected of it, and the Office of Secretary General was usually at the center of it all. Even opponents of the General Assembly creating an armed force, such as the Soviet Union, approved of the idea of the force, hence the Soviet abstention in the vote to create the force rather than a no vote. The USSR had to go along with whatever would support its national policy, namely, getting the UK, France, and Israel out of Egypt, and preventing open conflict with the Western powers, trademark. So, while objecting to the particulars of UNEF's creation, the USSR supported the principles of it. In this, their interest aligned with the United States in a rare moment. The combination of Soviet-American consensus, UN field experience, and the built-up expectation of flexible programs coming out of the Secretary General's office all played a role in the UN member states' quick acceptance of the concept of an international UN peacekeeping force, their eagerness to support it, and the swiftness of its implementation. Then, in turn, this experience would enable the creation and deployment of UNEF in just 48 hours when the Congo crisis erupted in 1961. If you're not familiar with UNEF, the United Nations operation in the Congo, please refer to Series 1 of United for Peace. It's got a lot more action than UNEF. Let us pause here and recap all of our reasons so far for the General Assembly creating the UNEF. The reputation and legitimacy of the United Nations was at stake. Another global conflict could have erupted from the Suez War. The United Nations explicitly existed to prevent such conflicts. UN flexibility had been normalized by 1956, and the interests of the superpowers, along with basically every major power besides France and the UK, aligned here. That sounds like enough to explain it already. But get this, there's even more to it, although the following reason is a bit more cynical. The Soviets did not actively oppose the creation of UNEF, despite maintaining it was illegal for the General Assembly to do so. The fact it served their interests may not be the only reason for this. Remember, the Soviet Union was dealing with the Hungarian anti-communist revolt of 1956, when the UK, France, and Israel invaded Egypt. The negative international attention on the USSR during this was bad enough without them actively obstructing a global response to blatant imperialist aggression, especially because, hey, opposing imperialism was ostensibly the single most important component of Soviet ideology. It was not in the Soviet interest to do both a little bit of its own red imperialism, propping up a puppet government, while also helping Western imperialists cling on to old Middle Eastern possessions. That is not the end of the Hungarian revolt's influence on these events, however. It overlapped with the Suez Crisis, and both tugged hard on the Secretary General, UN Security Council, and the General Assembly. But ultimately, the UN couldn't really do much about the situation in Hungary. The USSR and the recognized government of Hungary obstinately refused to admit any observers appointed by the Secretary General or approved by the General Assembly. And unsurprisingly, the Security Council was unable to put together anything for Hungary because of the Soviet P5 veto power. It is speculation to say so, but I don't think it's all that unreasonable to figure that the inability to do anything about the situation in Hungary inspired those in the UN to pursue any possible action regarding Egypt and the Suez, and that the Soviet Union was simultaneously moved not to oppose any UN action on the crisis because of the bad press from its dealings in Hungary. And so, this is the context in which we find the United Nations Emergency Force. Aside from the immediate political background we discussed at the beginning of this series in episode 2.1. Then, obviously, we have what the force did and why it collapsed. That's what the rest of the series is about. Let's now consider why the United Nations would never again assemble an armed mission from the General Assembly. Mainly, General Assembly authorized missions are legally dubious if total consent to their operations is not forthcoming from all relevant states. And this makes them, hypothetically, by default less efficient than those authorized by the Security Council. For example, it is remarkable how long UNEF had been deployed before the relationship between the force and Egyptian authorities was actually worked out in full. Major General Burns notes how difficult it made operations to conduct them without such relationship being certain. Had the Security Council authorized UNEF instead of the GA, the force could have operated however it wanted. Now, UN missions, even authorized by the Security Council, always communicate with host states and make sure they're not doing anything unnecessarily hostile to the wishes of said host. Nonetheless, the GA authorized UNEF had to conduct its mission cautiously and pretty much incompletely as it tiptoed around any possible objections Egyptian authorities might raise, whereas a Security Council authorized mission could have proceeded efficiently with a respectful, better to ask forgiveness than permission type attitude. Would this have enabled UNEF to complete its objectives in a more timely manner? Maybe, maybe not. We will never be able to tell for certain. One argument against is that, shy of sending an effective offensive force, even the legally binding nature of a Security Council resolution would not have made the Anglo-French Israeli forces pull out any faster than their voluntary withdrawal. One argument for is that the mere possibility of a UN force becoming an active combatant in the conflict would complicate the political calculations of the invaders, perhaps even to such a degree that they would not have held out as much hope as they historically did, that they could still extract some favorable conditions from the situation. Also, Egyptian authorities would have been likely to more or less roll with whatever UNEF authorities decide, so long as they weren't too draconian. Again, we will never know for sure, but we can be certain that the mission could have proceeded with much greater efficiency and confidence from the start had the Security Council created it, and UN leadership would have had much firmer grounds for deciding to keep UNEF in place in 1967, and that might, just might, have prevented the Six-Day War. With this in mind, even if the force would not have been extremely more efficient or effective, even a mildly more confident UN could have kept the force in place for longer and changed everyone's political calculus as to avoid yet another Arab-Israeli war. Even this small hope is enough to push for Security Council authorization above all else. Besides that, we have the political turmoil partially caused by objections to General Assembly authorization of an armed mission, which we discussed thoroughly last episode. These two factors would ensure that the UN would not use the General Assembly as a tool for armed peacekeeping again. Now, at the start of this episode, I listed the political conditions for Egypt withdrawing UNEF consent as something we would cover. Why would I cover it now rather than last episode? Well, I'll tell you. It's because the nuance is such that it further adds to the possibility that a Security Council mandate, rather than a General Assembly approval, could have made a big difference. Despite the relative calm UNEF managed to sustain on the Egyptian-Israeli border, which also contributed to peace along other Arab-Israeli frontiers, the fundamental issues underlying Arab-Israeli hostilities were never resolved. The rest of the world may have been tricked into believing the Middle East problem had been solved, and put quote marks around Middle East problem, by the way. But the absence of conflict does not necessarily mean the presence of peace. The General Assembly routinely approved funding for UNEF, but the Security Council never seriously addressed any Middle Eastern issues over the course of the mission, nor did the Secretariat make any serious moves to bring regional leaders together for diplomatic discussions. It is seriously frightening how little attention the UN and major powers generally paid to these fundamental issues, even as moves were made towards war as early as 1964. The first Arab summit, called by President Gamal Abdel Nasser in said year, laid down 3 stepping stones to continued conflict with Israel. First, the states in attendance agreed to investigate how to divert Jordan River tributaries to reduce water flow to the Israeli-held Sea of Galilee, otherwise known as Lake Tiberias. Then, they created a United Arab Command under Egyptian General Ali Amer. Finally, they founded the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, to continue partisan resistance to Israeli occupation of Palestinian land claims. The PLO is still around to this day, continuing said struggle. It is hard to imagine a more provocative action short of directly waging war. Now, before I continue, I say land claims there to include the entirety of the territory occupied by Israel and Palestine, rather than merely any quote-unquote legally recognized borders. After all, the Arab states more than likely would have liked to see the state of Israel completely destroyed if possible. Now, even with these provocative moves, however, we have a special situation with the Kingdom of Jordan. King Hussein really was doing all he could to maintain a peaceful situation with Israel otherwise. He shut down the PLO office in Amman and tried to prevent raids striking out from his kingdom at Israel. Amman being the capital of Jordan, by the way. Nonetheless, for not doing enough to stop raids originating from within its borders, Israel attacked Jordan at Es Samu on November 4th, 1966. And it isn't hard to see how Israel would believe Jordan to be complicit in, if not actively helping, these raids. After all, when Egypt and Syria denounced King Hussein's inactivity against Israel, he blamed the guerrilla fighters for not coordinating operations with him or the United Arab Command we just mentioned a minute ago. He then told President Nasser that if he wanted attacks on Israel so badly, he ought to dismiss the United Nations Emergency Force and allow for some Egyptian contributions. He went so far as to accuse Nasser of striking a secret agreement with Israel and keeping UNEF around to limit Palestinian activity along their border. Of course, UNEF was limiting Palestinian activity along the border, but not because of some secret arrangement. That was just the terms of the force. That was the global community trying to prevent another Middle Eastern war, with Egypt having approved of it previously to recover its own sovereign territory. Nonetheless, the charges were extremely provocative. After all, Nasser did in fact want to eliminate Israel. However, he did not think the Arab nations were yet ready for another all-out conflict with them, and they ought to prepare for a better, coordinated attack. President Atassi of Syria did not share this opinion. He provoked Israel greatly by endorsing the People's Liberation War on April 7, 1967, the anniversary of the Ba'athist Party. Subsequently, literally the same day, Israel launched a retaliatory raid into Syria. In light of this raid, Syria requested immediate assistance from Egypt, who then remilitarized the Sinai Peninsula and requested the withdrawal of UNEF. And so, although Nasser clearly did not think that a war with Israel at this time was a good idea, he fell into traps of political optics and tumbled headlong into conflict. Facing guerrilla attacks by an organization founded by a summit of hostile states, a full endorsement of war against itself by Syria, and Egyptian militarization towards its borders, Israel launched a preemptive attack against Egypt on June 5, 1967, convinced that Arab invasion was imminent. It should be noted, while Israel struck the first blow in the war, it was Jordan, Syria, and Egypt which had all mobilized first for the war. Even if you take this belligerency towards Israel as a valid move, considering it is a settler colonial state, that doesn't mean that this was a wise or noble move. The mobilizations against Israel were largely motivated by the personal interests of the leaders of these three Arab states, all seeking to reconsolidate power in the wake of popular unrest and doubts among the political elite. We don't have time to get into the specifics of this unrest and of these doubts, but just know that all three regimes were seriously fragile at this time and needed a way to shore up power. In the last episode, I said it would not have done much at all to call a meeting of the General Assembly or Security Council to debate the withdrawal of UNEF, but Indarikhe, in his book The Sinai Blunder, points out some utility such a course of action may have had. Open debate in the UN Security Council or General Assembly may have alarmed Egypt and helped ease Israeli fears, which reduces the overall likelihood of conflict actually beginning in this scenario we have witnessed. Plus, simply buying time often helps the international community in finding resolutions to security crises. People are rarely prepared on the spot to deal with a crisis, but given any time to think it over, a large group of people can usually come up with some fixes, even if only temporary ones. And it seems clear that neither Israel nor Egypt wanted another war. As much as Syria's leadership had pushed for elevated belligerency, Nasser did not think conditions suitable for an attack on Syria in 1967, and Israel simply wanted to maintain its borders. The war might be called a tragedy of errors. I would say comedy, but there's nothing funny about war. Right after the war, UN Truce Supervision Organization personnel were readily accepted as observers along the Golan Heights and the Suez Canal. after this lightning war, no one wanted to leave any risk of hostilities breaking out again. At least, not yet. That said, Israel occupied yet more land at the conclusion of this war, sparking a few more down the line. The welcome back of UN observers demonstrates well how the organization is considered an effective institution for maintaining peace. Yet it is unable to do so all on its own. With the Six-Day War, we have seen how the UN's failure to seriously engage with Middle Eastern issues led to a sort of inertial hostility building up towards another war. At the same time, however, it is difficult to solve any international political problems when the states immediately involved are themselves unwilling to meaningfully act upon them. And neither Israel nor the Arab states had any will to do so. So, what was the UN to do? If states do not want to change, then they simply won't unless forced to do so. Since political leaders in any major power of the time would benefit from unilateral action against either side, and the UN very well couldn't muster up enough strength to force a political settlement, no lasting solution was really on the table without Arab or Israeli willingness to work out political disputes. Once again, we see the United Nations failing to determine the course of events. And again, this is not so much a flaw as a feature, as it was specifically chartered in such a way as to make it essentially impossible for it to overrule the sovereignty of its members. If it well could, then the United Nations really would be a sort of world government. But instead, it is merely a forum for reinforcing existing international norms and forging new ones when enough of the world's statecrafters are convinced to do so is necessary. That is its whole point. And this has been useful many times, although it has never been enough to guarantee peace worldwide. For that, radical new ways of approaching international politics may be required. To quote Enrique directly, there are only few who understood that UNEF had proved useful and that it was not its failure that led to withdrawal. It was in fact a failure of diplomacy and the peacemaking process that led to the Six-Day War. What this really means is that while peacekeeping may wrap up or tamper down open hostilities, lasting peace, true peace, requires active efforts on the part of political actors with outstanding grievances. Those active efforts, manifesting in the form of diplomacy, is what is often called by observers of international relations peacemaking. And if peacemaking is full medical assistance, then peacekeeping is a mere band-aid. This concludes our series on the first United Nations Emergency Force. I know this episode is extremely late and I do apologize, but life comes at you fast, as I'm sure you're all aware. I regret to inform you all, the next series will likely take at least 2 months to begin. There are 61 UN peacekeeping missions in total, not all of them armed, so not all within the purview of this show, but I do want to review all of them at least a little bit before I start back up again. That way, I can better determine which mission to cover, at which time, and have a better overall sense of the grand history of peacekeeping. It will help me make this show more informative and hopefully more stimulating as a result. And you deserve that. Thank you for listening. Please join me next time on United for Peace as we dive into the United Nations Security Force in West New Guinea.